you look out at this dynamic, because I want to sort of combine two questions for you in the last couple of minutes. Mm-hmm. One is, and we see obviously there was some good news electorally in Argentina. There's the really important dynamic, even though there's brutal repression, but there's movements that are, they're compelling the world's attention in Chile and Ecuador and so on. And then in Brazil, obviously, President Lula, this kind of incredible force going from being a political prisoner to back at the center of the stage. So there are these countervailing forces. And then, if we consider, it's very complicated here, obviously, but even having a main candidate like Bernie Sanders actually speaking, calling a coup is example.
Absolutely.
There are these countervailing forces. So I want to know what you think the sort of prospects of renewing the left in the hemisphere are. And I'm also wondering, though, I just read an interview, I believe it was with Walden Bello, I think is the name. It was a Filipino academic. I should have had it in front of me. And he identified that there is this pattern of a sort of global enraged upper middle class. And you see it in the Trump vote. Mm-hmm. You see it in the Modi base. You see it certainly in the UK. You see it in Hungary. You see it in the types of people that would vote for Marine Le Pen in France. And you see it, maybe its most virulent manifestations in Latin America. And it is a cross between not quite elite enough to be completely insulated from declining economic prospects, particularly in relatively developed countries, but elite enough to have the type of rage that we talked about earlier at seeing people that they consider to be their social lessers of any form rising in esteem, even if, in fact, like during the pink tide, the policies overall benefited them as well. So I guess I'm curious about the prospects of renewal, and also if you have thoughts strategically for this global problem of that sort of sector of the middle class and its appeal in reactionary politics.
Yeah, sure. So I think definitely there is great polarization of politics right now in Latin America. And it's an ideological polarization, left versus right, more so than in ever, even than during the Cold War. What's interesting is that the left, for the first time, governed for a significant amount of time. So the first 10, 15 years, I've said already, in the 21st century, depending on how you count them, but you had between 11, 12, and 14 leftist governments in a region in the 20 Latin American republics, right? So it was a huge majority of countries that were governed by leftist governments who moved away from the sort of neoliberal austerity, but also asserted themselves on the global stage and didn't all want to be sort of, never-ending victims of the Monroe Doctrine and sort of wanted relations with China and these kinds of things. Very heterogeneous. They weren't all similar or the same, but they had a few there was a common denominator. Now, after the commodities decline, it affected a number of leftist projects. Obviously, the governments that were in power were hit by the economic decline. This is true also of right-wing governments. So if you think of Mexico, the exact reverse happened. You had a right-wing government in power, big economic crisis, the left benefited. But because it was a majority of leftist governments, the left lost out more from the commodities decline than the right, because it was governing in more places. So we've had this kind of return of the right. Now, the big mistake of the right has been to go back, to not learn from the past, and go back to these really aggressive neoliberal economic policies of the 80s and 90s that hurt Latin America so much, created so much inequality and institutional precariousness and so on and so forth. And I think what you're seeing in Latin America, these protests in Ecuador, protests in Chile, the elections in Argentina, had you not had an election, you would have probably had protests. People didn't protest because they thought, oh, we have an election, let's express ourselves through that way, But whenever there's a choice at the moment in Latin America, you're seeing it's moving back towards the left. When there isn't a choice, as in the case of Bolivia, when it's imposed, the right manages to grab hold of power or keep power. Think of Brazil as well. If there'd been a genuine choice, if Lula had been allowed to run, he would have won the election. So my hypothesis here is the aggressive right-wing cycle will be short if it's democratic, because people, I wouldn't overemphasize this kind of middle-class argument that they all want neoliberalism. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, some do, but a lot of them don't. And if they're given a choice, they vote for the left. But if the right-wing cycle is authoritarian, then it can last much longer. There's certainly, from what you said, I think, significant lessons to be had, particularly from the accompaniment that we gave, so that the Latin American left gave, to people who were being lifted out of poverty. There wasn't enough political and ideological accompaniment. I think political parties were too weak. There was too much stress on consumption and not enough contextualization of the historical process that we were living in. And when that consumption stopped, when that growth of income plateaued, people turned against us. I wouldn't say all the people. I wouldn't say that it's going to be reversible, or that it's a process like some of the process you described in other parts of the world. But enough, if there was repression of the left, if Lula was in jail, if Correa couldn't be there, if with a few other tools that were used by the right, enough to mean that we were defeated or kept out of power. So I think there's a lesson there of how to accompany that transition from being under the poverty line to becoming a middle class, and not falling in the old pattern of, I'm okay now, my family's okay, so I can look down on the people who are not to make me feel better. I can reproduce the class struggle that I've been a victim of. I mean, sure, there are lots of things that we need to correct there and to think about.
Well, I hope that you will be a guest on this show again. Guillaume Long serves as a senior policy analyst at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and he also was the foreign minister on the Rafael Correa government. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me on the show. I really enjoyed it.
Excellent. Talk to you soon. You just watched a Michael Brooks Show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.